Hello all, this is lesson 33, lecture 2, where we are continuing with the story of Nero's reign. And we have just observed him being an excellent triumphant artist and much less of a triumphant emperor in the traditional military sense. And so where I want to take this story is to that same year, which is the year 60, that saw the institution of those music festivals, the Neronia, at which Nero performed, and another important event that takes us to this part of the Roman Empire, that is to Britain. And so as Tacitus describes, while Nero was busy singing and performing, there was a sudden revolt in the province of Britain, which you might recall was just taken under Claudius. So this was a recent province. Before we read this passage, I just want to take a quick look at a map. And so here is Britain, or what would be sort of Great Britain today, would be even, of course, Northern Ireland. And here we are in what is today the city of London, which was already an Londinium in the Latin name at this time. And the group that will revolt is the Iceni right here. And that's what we are going to read about. And again, we are in the year 60. And so this is what we find out in section 14, book 14, section 31 in Tacitus. The Icenian king, Prasutagus, celebrated for his long prosperity, had named the emperor his heir, together with his two daughters. So the idea is that he's letting Nero become the next ruler. An act of deference, which he thought would place his kingdom and household beyond the risk of injury. The result was contrary, so much so that his kingdom was pillaged by centurions, his household by slaves, as though they had been prizes of war. As a beginning, his wife Boudica was subjected to the lash and his daughters violated, which is Tacitus' code for rape. All the chief men of the Icenians were stripped of their family estates, and the relatives of the king were treated as slaves. Impelled by this outrage and the dread of worse to come, for they had now been reduced to the status of a province, they flew to arms and incited to rebellion the Trinobantes and others, who, not yet broken by servitude, had entered into a secret and treasonable compact to resume their independence. So the idea is that after they sort of the revolt kind of will start here with the Iceni. You see here are the Trinobantes, right? And then probably the revolt would spread further in all of the green areas here. But the figure who should really capture interest is this queen, Boudica, who was the widow of the king of the Iceni. And we see that Tacitus allows her to give some speeches as part of this revolt. Now, at a day and age when videotapes of these were obviously not surviving, what I want you to think about as we are reading this passage is when Boudica speaks, it's really, of course, Tacitus writing. What is he trying to tell us about Nero by depicting this British woman as speaking against the Romans taking over her home and her homeland? Okay, so this is what she had to say. So she's mounted in a chariot with her daughters before her, rode up to clan after clan and delivered her protest. It was customary, she knew, with Britons to fight under female captaincy, but now she was avenging, not as a queen of glorious ancestry, her ravished realm and power, but as a woman of the people, her liberty lost, her body tortured by the lash, the tarnished honor of her daughters. Roman cupidity had progressed so far that not their very persons, not age itself, nor maidenhood were left unpolluted. Yet heaven was on the side of their just revenge. One legion which ventured battle had perished. The rest were skulking in their camps or looking around them for a way to escape. They would never face even the din and roar of those many thousands, far less their onslaught and their swords. If they considered in their own hearts the forces under arms and the motives of the war, on that field they must conquer or fall. Such was the settled purpose of a woman. The men might live and be slaves. And I think that one sort of very clear message that Tacitus has here is that it takes a foreign woman, right? It takes someone who is sort of doubly disadvantaged. She is obviously not Roman, and she's also not a male commander, but she suggests that she will be ready to fight and push it all the way. And if the men want to settle, let them settle and let them be slaves. And so we get from Tacitus in this speech a sort of very clear critique of all those individuals who live under Nero, who are members of the Roman elite and are men, who do not say much of anything, who don't resist, who let Nero get away with being such a terrible emperor at this time. Now, I think that it is not necessarily the case that Tacitus thinks that it would have been so easy to do so, right? It's not just like you put up your hand and you tell Nero that you really don't like how things are going. Probably would have been killed on the spot anyways, but more about sort of upholding some ideals, right? Like what is Rome standing for when we have an emperor who is singing on stage while we have these brave Roman women trying to fight us? And I should say that Boudica goes down as a really big fantasy figure in later history, and there's an endless number of books you can read about her. And, she sort of created her own modern cult of people who really like her and are interested in her. However, rather sadly, the revolt itself is a fail. Because in the second time that Boudica's troops encountered the Romans, they actually lost, and we get sort of this depiction in Tacitus about sort of how that the Romans actually ultimately do succeed against the Brits and against the troops of Boudica. So he says, the glory won in the course of the day was remarkable and equal to that of our older victories, for by some accounts, little less than 80,000 Britons fell, at a cost of some 400 Romans killed and a not much greater number wounded. Boudica ended her days by poison, and the newcomer, the new leader, abstained from provoking the enemy, was not challenged himself, and conferred on the spiritless inaction the honorable name of peace. So it's a very sort of rich depiction of sort of what happens. The battle is won by the Romans, and lots and lots of Brits are killed, and Boudica herself commits suicide, which is something maybe to keep in mind for later on in this class, that is one of the early suicides we will encounter. But then we also find that then we get a new leader in Britain. And Tacitus's depiction there is not quite as celebratory, and it's, he loves the victory of the battle, right? This was like one of our older victories, right? We did really well. But then when the Roman commander then takes over and tries to secure a province and rule, he describes it as spiritless inaction with the honorable name of peace, which is a little bit of a sad depiction of how, there was peace, at what cost, and what that meant. So this little interlude about Boudica's revolt in Britain in the year 60 is just an interesting moment for us to take a moment and see how non-masculine Nero is, how much, in fact, quite a bit of this revolt was in fact provoked by the Romans wanting to get more and more money out of the provinces, much of which was really plainly abused by the Roman imperial organization, and especially the emperor. So we kind of get a sense of this contrast, right? We have the Phil Hellene singer, actor, Nero, and then we have the brave woman who is ready to die for what she believes in. I think the contrast sort of speaks for itself. And so whether we now look at Suetonius's Life of Nero, and this is section 26-27, which on your handout you can see is the turning point in his depiction. This is what we find out about Nero. So we are moving into the second stage of Nero's reign, in which we get really pretty much the definition of a bad emperor. So here, Suetonius has this to say: although at first his acts of wantonness, lust, extravagance, and avarice and cruelty, wow, that's a mouthful, were gradual and secret, and might be condoned as follies of youth, Yet even then, their nature was such that no one doubted that they were defects of his character and not due to his time of life. No sooner was twilight over than he would catch up a cap or a wig and go to the taverns or range about the streets playing pranks, which, however, were very far from harmless, for he used to beat men as they came home from dinner, stabbing any who resisted him and throwing them into the sewers. He would even break into shops and rob them. So what we see here is clearly now we are moving beyond bad emperor and we are moving into the really bad person who is taking advantage of his imperial power. And what Suetonius suggests that this was not youthful folly anymore, right? He is in his 20s, he's an emperor. He should be knowing better than doing this. So these are the facts of his character. And then in 27, little by little, as his vices grew stronger, he dropped jesting and secrecy and with no attempt at disguise openly broke out into worse crime. He prolonged his revels from midday to midnight, often limiting himself by a warm plunge, or if it were summer, into water cold with snow. Pretty cold, by the way. Sometimes, too, he closed the inlets and banqueted in public in the great tank in the Campus Martius or in the Circus Maximus, waited on by harlots. That would be the way the translation describes the prostitutes, and dancing girls from all over the city. So we get this sort of depiction of the vices, right? So we can have an emperor full of virtues, or we can have one full of vices. And what Suetonius seems to imply here, that as Nero's rule goes on, he has the power to not even pretend that he is a virtuous emperor, but openly be engaging those vices. Now, one of the things that we have seen earlier, that Nero's early good rule had two figures who were very key to his sort of good behavior. And one of those was Seneca the Younger, the philosopher, and the next one was Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. And in the year 62, we see that Nero's relationship with both of those people will end in the same year. And so first, let's take a quick look at the end of Burrus. But while the evils of the state were growing daily more serious, the resources of the state were dwindling, and Burrus took his leave of life, whether by sickness or by poison may be doubted. Sickness was conjectured from the fact that he ceased to breathe as the result of a gradual swelling of the interior of the throat and a consequent obstruction of the windpipe. It was more generally asserted that by Nero's instructions, his palate was smeared with a poisonous drug, ostensibly as a remedy, and that Burrus, who had understood the crime, on receiving a visit from the emperor, averted his eyes from him and answered his inquiries with the bare words, "I am well." So we don't even know, was Burrus poisoned or did he just die naturally? But the implication, recall again, rhetorical order, is that, and also Tacitus says it was more generally asserted, more people thought that in fact, pretending that they were offering him medication and treatment, he was in fact poisoned. And this not knowing, I think, gives us a sense of just how scary it is to be close to Nero at this time, in terms of you might just die. And so let's see what happens with Seneca. Is the death of Burrus shook the position of Seneca, for not only had the cause of decency lost in power by the removal of one of its two champions, but Nero was inclining to worse counselors, right? So in fact, Nero will have some advisors now who will be really not helpful to him. Seneca asked to retire, but Nero denied it. Seneca, such is the end of all dialogues with an autocrat, expressed his gratitude, but he changed the established routine of his former power, banished the crowds from his antechambers, shunned his attendants, and appeared in the city with a rareness ascribed to his detention at home by adverse health or philosophic studies. So we see that Seneca essentially is trying to retire, and Nero says no, and he just says, it's a beautiful description. All Nero can be told at that point, thank you so much for listening to me, right? Even though he just denied Seneca's request. So this is the end of all dialogues with an aristocrat. Things are starting to get even worse. So let's see where that goes in the following lecture.